So, Professor Jiang, I'm sure you guys have heard the name, and it's quite interesting. I first came across Professor Jiang, I would say about a couple of months ago. It wasn't that long ago, but it was prior to his more recent kind of like explosion into fame, where he's been appearing on all of the, the news shows, and he's had a couple of interviews with Sneeko and this, that, and the other, and he's basically been getting a lot of notoriety recently. But his channel did come up on my feed a few months ago, and I remember being intrigued. First of all, it wasn't none of this like war stuff. He was talking about, he had interpretations of the Bible that were non-conventional, let's say. He had very unconventional perspectives on biblical history. And he caught me with like a couple of headlines initially. It was to do with Rome, Paul. Yeah, that was it. It's just coming back to me now. So his perspective was to do with Paul being a Roman plant, which I thought was an interesting theory. It was an interesting theory, and it was relatively well supported. And I kind of enjoyed it. I'm not gonna lie, I enjoyed that kind of like, exposition, and the idea of Paul kind of being a Roman who was sent to infiltrate and to basically bastardize Christianity or this Christ movement, and to turn it into something palatable, turn it into something controllable. And I thought it was quite interesting. I was like, this is okay. And then he had another, I tried to watch more of his videos after that, and none of them were really landing for me. And I started to think, and even with the Paul one, because I'm relatively knowledgeable of the kind of like the biblical sphere, so to speak, being a former Christian myself and someone who was quite an avid reader when I was a Christian. And obviously, and the fact that I do history and ancient Egypt, and that all of that world is kind of related, that kind of like Fertile Crescent area of the world is kind of related. So I had insights into some of the stuff that he's talking about, and I realized he made quite a few mistakes.
I'm not sure if this statistic is correct. You can tell me if this is correct or not, right? But apparently 20% of all American white girls in their 20s are on OnlyFans, something like that. All right? The Russians are so pessimistic. Okay, first of all, it's really cold in Russia. Okay, if it's cold, you're not that optimistic, right? Second of all, Russian civilization is built on violence, right? The Americans basically went over and were able to steal the continent from the natives. The natives didn't really put that much in existence. But Russia was built on tremendous violence.
But I thought, it's forgivable at the end of the day. He's not an expert in all fields. So then I was quite, not going to say surprised, but when I saw him exploding into the sphere as more of a political commentator, I was really interested. I was like, oh, okay, it's this guy again. And he's got some more theories. And I already, because I had the backstory of who he was and already had some experience with some of his material, I already wasn't taken, because I already thought to myself, well, he's not that brilliant, but let's just see what he's come up with. And his whole claim to fame is this idea that he's made these 3 bold predictions.
All right, guys, we've got yet another heavy hitter guest and first-time guest on the show, Professor Jiang. He is the star of the popular YouTube channel Predictive History. He uses game theory to analyze past, current, and to predict future geopolitical events. For people who aren't familiar with your work, I wanted to show folks that back in 2024, you made 3 big predictions. 1, that Trump would win. 2, that he would start a war with Iran. And 3, that the U.S. would lose that war. Let's take a listen to that.
In this class this semester, I'm making 3 big predictions, right? First is that Trump will win in November. Second is that the United States will go to war against Iran. And the third big prediction is that the United States will lose this war, which will forever change the global order.
Prediction number 1 is Trump was going to win the election, which is like, that was 50-50. Let's be honest, that was 50-50. So not that massive a prediction. Number 2 was that Trump was going to invade Iran. Now I'm gonna say that one wasn't so predictable, okay, because Trump wasn't as pro-war in his last term. So I'm gonna say that one maybe had a 30% chance. Okay, it's a 30% chance. And the third one, which hasn't happened yet, was that America is going to lose the war with Iran. Now that's the one that hasn't happened yet. So everyone's acting like, oh, this guy, he makes predictions and they're so amazing. And I'm not hating, by the way, but it's kind of like the two predictions he has, even if we was going to give him generous probabilities, take the first one, I said that's a 50% chance. The next one, that's a 30% chance. So that's like his prediction kind of like rarity ratio, so to speak, is like 15%. So there's a 15% chance, 15 in 100 people could have guessed that, what so it's not like, he's not an idiot, and obviously there weren't easy predictions to make, but at the same time, it's not like he hasn't made 5 predictions. He hasn't made 5. He's made 3 predictions, and they're moderate predictions, and one of them still has to come to pass. So why is he getting all of this attention? What is all of this kind of like, people seem to be really enthralled by everything that he has to say, and he's being viewed as this really brilliant man. And I realized something almost immediately. Professor Jiang is experiencing something we call a positive stereotype. Okay, that's what he's doing. We are often exposed to Far Eastern intelligence in the form of mathematical intelligence and scientific intelligence, and I guess in the field of manufacturing. So everyone accepts the fact that Chinese people, Japanese people are good at computers, they're good at mathematics, they're good at the sciences, those kind of things. They're the kind of technical things, really, really good. The thing that we rarely encounter is Chinese people with charisma. And when I say charisma, I mean the ability to hold an audience. And because that's like the trifecta, if you've got that. If you're Chinese and you've also got that kind of thing where you speak and everybody is kind of like, I mean, let's be honest with you, who's the last Chinese commentator that you were aware of? Often there seems to be a kind of like a trade-off in terms of the should we call it intellectual brilliance, seems to trade off in terms of the ability for them to hold an audience, the gravitas, so to speak. They seem to lack that. But he has a bit of gravitas, he's interesting to listen to. And so essentially the fact that he's so interesting to listen to and the fact that he's Chinese, is blinding people's eyes to the fact that a lot of the stuff he says is really basic. And I don't mean that in a rude way, but listening to Professor Jiang speak, particularly in the political sphere, I think he's much more well equipped when it comes to the biblical sphere. I think he's a theologian, to be honest with you. And I think he's masquerading at the moment. He's a capable theologian. He's got good biblical theories. I think that's his kind of field. He should get into the field of kind of like arguing or debating theological history and also making theological predictions. I think that's where he's kind of well weighted. But in this political sphere, his knowledge about, general history is really, really poor.
Was a weapon or a virus created by capitalism in order to conquer the world, in order to destroy the world so that capitalism can spread throughout the world. In many ways, communism is a creation of capitalism as a weapon to destroy capitalism's major enemies, okay? So communism is not really the enemy.
He makes really glaring errors. He's got like a really basic ChatGPT level of knowledge about most things that he speaks about. And then he reminds me of when I, was first exposed to the, first exposed to the idea that there were secret societies, and you used the word Illuminati for the first time, and you got all of these conspiracy theories. When you first start to think outside the box, so to speak, and you realize that the mainstream media is controlled and it's biased and it's not on it. That's what he reminds me of. He's at that kind of very rudimentary level, and many of his theories are very, very rudimentary, and maybe that's why they're appealing to, I'm assuming that most of his audience is relatively young. And I think his way of speaking is very appealing, because he's like maybe this generation's David Icke, but except David Icke, I think, is far more knowledgeable in most of the stuff that he talks about than this guy, Professor Jiang, is. But he's Chinese, so everyone thinks that the stuff he's saying is really intelligent. that's it. This is what you call positive discrimination. This is when your ethnic group actually is playing into your favor, where everyone is expecting you to be this really smart, intelligent person. So even when you say things that are patently idiotic, you seem to get away with it. But anyway, that's the video there. Professor Jiang, what do you think? Do you think he's as intelligent as he's being made out, or do you think he's a hype job? Let me know. Catch you guys later. Peace.